This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Vanessa Van Edwards, and she's an expert. She's done the homework in an area where every last one of us needs to do better. How to captivate, how to be more charismatic, how to walk into that cold room and be at peace, to make progress, to meet people. There is some serious neuroscience behind all of her work, some serious experimentation, some serious surveying and testing. She brings a very science-based approach to attraction. I mean, some of the topic areas that she goes into are things that we all must master if we want to have a normal life. How do you interpret body language? The psychology of jealousy. How to persuade. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Vanessa Van Edwards. Very few people, if any of us, have any idea, any damn idea how anyone works, do we?
It's true.
I mean, literally, we go through life, we think we know, but the reality is what we're really thinking about ourselves, how we think, and we perhaps imagine, incorrectly, obviously, that everyone is thinking like us.
You know, it's interesting because I think that when we grow up, we're taught the golden rule, right? And the golden rule is treat others as you would want to be treated. And that's kind of how I operated for the first half of my life. And then I realized that actually people view how they want to be treated very differently. And that golden rule tends to trip us up. I much prefer, I don't know if you've heard of the platinum rule, which is treat others as they would want to be treated. And I think that what you're talking about is this fundamental idea that we think we know how other people feel. We think we know what lens, like that our lens is the same as their lens. But actually, we have very, very different ways of looking at the world and relationships. And it's more important to tap into how other people see the world instead of how you see the world.
That's a big challenge to find out. Look, we could start just the very first moment, and you talk about this in your work, the very first moment we meet someone. We are immediately drawing all kinds of thoughts, visions, biases in the first few seconds. Yeah. Before we know anything about them. We've already got this built-in, almost immediate view of who or what we think that person is. And from that moment, it's then about, okay, are we going to actually learn? Are we going to change? Are we going to actually find out what the truth is? But we actually think we know the truth before we even know, don't we?
Well, as I started studying the science of human behavior, I realized that what you're talking about is a combination of intuition and snap judgment. We are far better than we think at intuition and snap judgment if we let our bodies do the work. And there's an interesting moment that I experienced this in real life. I was in New York and I was on the subway late at night. It was after a friend's birthday party. And I stepped onto a subway car. Almost immediately, I felt like something wasn't right. And I didn't know what it was, but like my heart started beating really fast. My hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I got goosebumps and I'm looking around this car and I'm like, nothing is wrong. Everything's okay. Like telling myself it, but I've had this really bad feeling. Not a minute later, when we got to the very next stop, the doors open and a man sitting right next to me, he might have actually been standing next to me with his holding onto the strap, grabs the woman's purse right at the edge of the door and runs off with her purse. Now, thank goodness there was a security guard who was right above the stairs who apprehended him, got the purse back. It was okay. But that moment was like this really, I was like, how did I feel or sense or smell this, that there was something wrong? And I couldn't even tell you which person it was in the car. And I read a study a year later that finally answered this question. And I think it ties into what we're talking about here. is it was actually done with skydivers, first-time skydivers. And what they did is they wanted to see if we can sense fear. Many animals are said to have, fear pheromones. What they did is they had first-time skydivers wear sweat pads, kind of a gross experiment, wear sweat pads underneath their armpits and run on the treadmill for 30 minutes. So they would sweat into their sweat pads. Then they put on a suit, a skydiving suit, go up into a plane, and they jumped out of a plane. And they also wore a second pair of sweat pads. Then they had poor participants in this experiment, smell these sweat pads when they were in a brain scanner. What they found is that even though the volunteers had no idea what they were smelling, when they smelled the fear ones, the ones where they were jumping out of a plane, their fear part of the brain and their amygdala lit up. In other words, we can sense, we can smell, like there is actually something physically going on in our body when we first meet someone. That might be fear, that might be confidence, that might be charisma, that might be excitement, but our emotions are catching. And so those first few seconds of interaction are incredibly important because you're literally infecting someone with an emotion.
What's interesting about your example is you did not know the purse was going to be stolen. You didn't know who, you just felt it. I will relate really quickly, having been outside the States for a few years, in and out. But I was in San Francisco, central San Francisco, just eating at a restaurant last fall. We walked out of the restaurant. Walking out on that street, I could just feel everything on that street was wrong within seconds. And I didn't want to walk around the block. I knew, and you could quickly see what was going on in the street, nothing good. But it's just one of those things. I didn't have a prediction as to what was going to happen, but you knew the odds had increased that you didn't want to be there.
Yeah.
Similar to your train situation. You could intuitively, with enough experience, you could feel this.
So that exactly. And like whenever I share that story, I love that people have stories back, because I think that what we're talking about is there's two different kinds of human behavior. Like we can talk about absolutely like the physical cues, purposeful cues. But there's also this whole other mysterious side of human behavior, which are the subconscious cues, the things that are happening below our cognitive thoughts. I think that's where we can get some really interesting things. And in my book and my work, I try to tie the two together, bringing what's unconscious into conscious.
Take me back in time a little bit. So I see these phrases here: behavioral investigator, body language trainer, all very intriguing. Like you want to know, who is this woman and what is she doing exactly? How do you study body language? Take me back in time to that pivot. At some point in time, you're a young lady, you're in school, whatever. You make a pivot and you say, this is my life's passion. What took you down this pivot of studying people, their behavior, their interactions between each other? What was the pivot for you?
Yeah, I was really scratching my own itch. I mean, they always say that the best companies, the best ideas happen when you're, using your own pain point. And that is 100% true in this. I joke that I'm a recovering awkward person because I am one of those people, unfortunately, where people skills didn't come naturally to me at all. The playground was rough. High school and college were just miserable. I begged my teachers to let me stay in the classroom at recess because I was so afraid of the playground.
You look normal. I'm looking at a picture of you. You look normal.
Yay! I made it, and I convinced you. You wouldn't know this, and I think a lot of people who I work with, like they have social fears or awkwardness, and you wouldn't know that by looking at them. The problem was that adults in my life, very well-meaning adults, teachers and parents, would say things like, "Oh, don't worry, you'll figure yourself out," or "Just be nice," or "Just make friends when you go to camp," or like kind of these very general, very vague sort of, "She'll pick it up eventually." So what ended up happening was I got very into the book smarts, the IQ side, abandoning my people intelligence completely, hoping that it would sort of catch up with me one day. And of course it didn't. Got to college and realized that I either had to catch up my people skills or I was going to fail. Like there was no way that I was going to be able to interview, negotiate, interact with people, make friends with colleagues if I didn't try to level up that side of my skill set. So a wonderful professor in college introduced me the idea that you could study people skills like I study for chemistry or math. And I have more of a programming kind of mind. I think more black and white. I like formulas. I like frameworks. I like blueprints. I started to try to find
systems.
Yeah, systems thinking. I tried to apply systems thinking to people skills, which really, soft skills were sort of considered gray and, smile, be interested to be interesting, kind of very vague ideas. And so once I started making formulas and then sharing those formulas, I realized there was a lot more people like me. That's when I officially decided, okay, I need to start actually doing real research. And so that's when we started the lab and we started to embark on our first experiments, see what was really out there, what kind of science we could find.
Your story, what you do, this, if I think back to the hard knocks path that I went down, I would have loved to have had this kind of exposure as a young person, this type of training that you're doing, this understanding this science. I mean, I was a young guy at 21 years of age running for political office, doing Washington Post interviews, local TV interviews. I had a book come out several years later, and I ended up years later after that going on stage in front of 1,000+ people in China. So I've gone through all these experiences that got me to this place where I feel very comfortable with people. But man, did I have to spend a lot of time to get this understanding that you're talking about. And what I think is really interesting, especially in this day and age where everyone is immersed inside an iPhone. I mean, the things that you're talking about, it's not like we're getting better on these things. We're getting worse.
Yes, I totally agree. And what's funny about it is, so I think that we're similar. A lot of people and maybe listeners are like, yes, I had that moment where I realized, my God, I really have to learn to negotiate or learn conversation starters. I learned so much about humanity by looking at our Google search results, by looking at, or rather the analytics of what people are searching for to get to our website. So this is one of my favorite things to do. I do it every Friday. It's a kind of a reward for the week where I look at what are the search terms that people used to stumble upon our very unique, very weird videos and articles. It's not a very typical kind of business. People search things like how to be interesting, right? Which is such a interesting thing, a need, a pain point, right? And most of these are very highly intelligent adults who are very successful, but they're either at networking events or at parties or on dates, and they have this really difficult pain point where they feel boring. Now, they're not boring. I actually don't believe that anyone is boring, but because they have this pain point, they're trying to catch up this skill that was never really formally taught.
I'm an introvert. I imagine that the people that are typing how to be interesting into Google are 99% introverts. Am I completely crazy?
Oh, okay. That's such a good point. So we actually know this. We do a lot of demographic research on our readers. So most of our readers are ambiverts. So we do have a lot of introverts. I'm also an ambivert. So an ambivert, and most people haven't heard this. They're usually given two, people are said, oh, you're either an introvert or an extrovert. And I think, and you can tell me if you're wrong, I bet you're an ambivert too. There's this third category, which is basically situational introversion. So in certain situations around certain people, you will withdraw. You don't get energy. You need to reset. Whereas in other situations, like a podcast or a conference or a party with your friends, you kind of come alive and you feel like you have no inhibitions. So most people fall into this third category, which I actually think is much more helpful than the introversion, extroversion categories. Do you think that you're an ambivert? Are you sure?
I think I'm an introvert, but I think what you're describing is accurate in the sense that I can go into the situation for the moment. I can reach into that situation for the moment and be an extrovert that no one thinks is an introvert. But when it's over, I want out of the moment. I want back to introversion.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So I think that one of the exercises I do with a lot of my students is I have them try to think about where are the places that take the most energy versus give the most energy. For someone who's a little bit more leaning on the introvert side, maybe there's a lot less entries, right? Social entries for the thrive column. A lot more in the survive. But knowing where you optimize sets yourself up for success. So for example, I think that everyone has their own unique brand of charisma. I think that the biggest mistake that people skills books or interpersonal websites teach is that everyone should be the bubbly extrovert. That just doesn't work for people. I don't believe in fake it till you make it. So if you absolutely hate networking events and you go and you try to fake it till you make it, that comes across as inauthentic. What I'd much rather have you do is figure out what are your unique social strengths, where do you thrive, and then how can you optimize your interactions for that? And the example that I always give, and this happens to me constantly, is I work really well one-on-one. I love deep conversations. I love intense conversation starters. I don't like sort of the casual conversations. So nightclubs, bars, really loud locations are like a nightmare. If, you're like, hey, what's your name? You're like yelling at each other, and so you can't really talk, and I get really awkward. Whereas like one-on-one coffees, podcasts, conferences are okay. So I will try, if someone, like a friend says, hey, come to my birthday at this bar, I'll be like, I'll take you out to dinner beforehand, and then you can go to the bar afterwards. So like knowing what to say yes or no to, I think is extremely helpful for setting yourself up for success.
There's an overall big picture word that I think describes if someone is going to take your insights and succeed. One of the first things they need to have, though, to get to that place where they can accept these insights is a certain confidence. And I love this quote that you put from Vince Lombardi in your work. Confidence is contagious, and so is lack of confidence. And a customer will recognize both. A lack of confidence. I can't tell you how many times during the course of a day I will see lack of confidence. And there's no reason. I mean, it's literally a switch in one's head. They can switch the switch. They don't have to be not confident. That doesn't mean they're all of a sudden, it's at some super high skill level that they're not, as you say, not fake it till you make it. But there's no reason to not be confident. You don't, I mean, and what people don't, the people that are not appearing confident, what they don't realize is that those of us that are confident can read their lack of confidence in a split second.
Yes. And so, okay, it's interesting. You mentioned a switch, right? Like it's a switch in the brain. And I bet a lot of people listening are like, no way, like it's not a switch. But there's a really interesting set of studies that I have to share, which when I read, I was just like shocked. So this was done by Alison Woodbrooks at Harvard Business School. What she wanted to test was this exact idea that we're talking about, is if you are anxious or nervous, what do you do with that? If you have to then go and perform, like you're really nervous about a negotiation, but you have to go negotiate, or you're really anxious about a networking event, how do you actually feel more confident or leverage that confidence? So what she did is she set up an experiment where she asked students to sing in front of a group, Don't Stop Believing, the famous song, karaoke style. And what students did is they had to sing it into a software that rated them for accuracy. So hitting the right notes, hitting the right words. This is, by the way, an incredibly nerve-wracking endeavor for most people, unless you're a singer. It's very scary to think about singing this on cue. So of course, immediately students started getting nervous. In one group, she had them say out loud, I'm nervous, before recording their song. The other group, she had them say, I'm excited, before recording. And the last group was a control group. The nervous group, the one that said I'm nervous, had 53% accuracy in the software. The control group had 69% accuracy. The excited group had 80% accuracy in the software. Now,
it's state of mind.
This wasn't even like a huge mindset intervention. It was literally just forcing them to say, I'm excited. And what she thinks was happening behind the scenes here, and by the way, they replicated this also for a panel of job evaluators, so it also worked in a more professional setting, that when we feel anxious or nervous, there are literally physiological changes that happen in our body. Our heart begins to pound, our palms sweat, we might get a little bit short of breath, we blush or blanch. That actually can work to our advantage. Adrenaline can be a very good thing. But if you think of it as nerve-wracking, it slows you up. It gives you dry mouth. It makes you feel very distracted. Whereas if you say, I'm excited, just like when you fall in love, your heart races, you might blush or sweat. It can actually be something that is a good thing. And so that simple mindset shift of I'm a little bit nervous, nope, I'm excited, actually it serves as a kind of switch.
I was thinking about the non-confident in my mind when I deal with the non-confident, and I was just jotting down phrases here. The non-confident, when I deal with them, I feel often from them criticism, illogical skepticism, anger. I mean, there's like these traits. It's like You can, and I just don't think, and I'm going to take this in another direction here in a second. I just don't think the non-confident think about that they've got this blinking light on their forehead that says, I'm not confident, I'm not confident. It's this, and like they can, as you just pointed out, they can change that. Let me switch that into even and take it to a higher level. I love this also from your work, and I'm going to let you expand on it because I think it's right in the same headspace, but taking it to a higher level. Great expectations are met with greatness. Boy, I love that. I mean, if you demand of yourself, if you have that expectation, that alone, that start right there of the expectation is going to give you a much greater chance of the greatness.
Yes. And we don't realize that we're in control of it. A lot of people, they go in hoping for something. But what I say is you can go into an interaction knowing what you want, and that will actually often, not always, create it instead of just hoping for it. So the idea of expecting greatness brings you greatness or creates greatness has to do with something called the Pygmalion effect. The myth of Pygmalion is that Pygmalion created a sculpture of the most beautiful woman. As he created the sculpture, he began to fall in love with the sculpture. One day, he kissed her on the lips and she came to life. The idea of the Pygmalion is that you create the beauty or the greatness that you want. And this has been replicated in many, many different areas. So, for example, teachers who are told that certain students are high achievers or better than others then treat those students better, and those students actually become high achievers. If you tell someone that they are one of the highest donators, they will then in turn donate more. It's prime expectations. And I think that we don't realize that we can do this in every interaction that we have. One of the biggest ways is in our emails. So if you're sending a lot of emails back and forth, as I am on a daily basis, you are actually priming people to act a certain way before phone calls, before interactions, before negotiations, before meetings. For example, I used things like, hey guys, Friday, we have a really tight schedule for our meeting. We only have 15 minutes. Try to keep your answers real short so we can go over everything we need to cover. I'm a little bit worried about hitting our deliverable in time, but hopefully we'll be able to do it. That would be kind of a typical email that I would send out in a stressful time. The problem is that was actually priming everyone who received the email to be worried, stressed, and on a time crunch. It was like I was setting myself up for a stressful meeting before it even happened. What would have been much better was to prime for productivity, efficiency, feelings of capability. So I could have said, instead of hey guys, I could have said hey team. Hey team, I'm excited about our meeting on Friday, right? Excited. We have a lot to cover. I'm absolutely sure that we can cover everything. I'm hoping that everyone will be really efficient with their answers and we will get everything done as needed. I'm looking forward to a positive ending. Just that change in language sets you up for having a more productive, positive meeting. And so that's a very small example of how expectations and how you create expectations and make them come to life.
As we, in a limited time today, cover some of these topics, it's going to make a lot more sense if people do a little more reading, and you've done quite a bit of writing on these subjects. So I think it's one of these things where you really pick up your work and you do have a lot of aha moments really quick. Let me shift you into something that is not as easy for me, but I've gotten better at it. And let's talk about walking into the cold room. Everyone has to do this. Let's say it's some conference, it's a party, whatever. You walk into the room and everyone knows this feeling. There's strangers everywhere. Some groups are huddled up. Perhaps there's a bar that's serving drinks. And now you've got this situation and you've got to do something with it. And let's say you don't know 90% of the people in the room. You've got to do something with this room and make it work. Why don't you give people a mini crash course? Give them something constructive to think about approaching that cold room.
When you're walking into a cold room, what are usually the first few things that you think when you walk into a cold room?
When can I leave?
Yep,
That's the first thing I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Why am I here? Why am I here? Can I leave now? I'm going to leave now. Okay, I'm leaving now.
Yes, totally. So you are not alone. Matt, you are not alone in that worry. What most people think when they first walk into a cold room is, what do I do? What do I say? Where do I stand? That's typically the first few questions that are sort of people are encountering. And I had a really hard time with cold rooms in the beginning of my career. I was going to all these networking events. You're told, say yes to everything, go out, work, build your network, right? And I was also told, work a room. Now, this is one of those phrases that you hear all the time, but means nothing, right? If you're not a natural born extrovert, that doesn't mean anything to you. So I was like, what if we actually studied what it means to work a room? So in our lab, we decided to do a study on working a room. So what we did is we partnered with a couple of local organizations. I'm in Portland, Oregon. And so we partnered with a couple of local organizations where we asked them if we could film and survey their networking event. So at each networking event, we set up 4 cameras, one in each corner of the room. As people entered the room, we gave them a little pre-survey. And on the pre-survey, it had a couple different questions to kind of assess their introversion level as well as their networking prowess. So it was questions like, do you enjoy networking? Are you going to know a lot of people tonight? What is your networking goal for the evening? Those kinds of things. So we had them fill out that pre-survey. Then we had them enter the room. We gave everyone a number, and we actually them around the room. So we began looking at their foot patterns, their conversation patterns, verbal patterns. Were they did they talk more with their hands? Did they power pose more? Did they move more frequently? Just trying to figure out what is it that they do differently, specifically the super connectors. So super connectors were the people where at the end of the night when we did a post survey, so everyone who left had to fill out a little post survey with questions like, how many business cards did you collect? Did you achieve your networking goal? Did you have a good time tonight? To see how effective they were and how much they enjoyed it. Because effectiveness can be numbers, but it also could be enjoyment. We also then looked them up on LinkedIn to see if we could find the people who had the most connections, who were also employed. What we found was there was a small group of super connectors, people who really did work the room. Somehow they collected the most business cards. They had the most fun. They were able to get the most connections from cold to warm. And they made very specific patterns in the room compared to the low connectors, the connectors who didn't make any connections in the room. So first we'll start with the low connectors. The low connectors made the brutal mistake, which I didn't realize this was a mistake until this study, of standing in start zone. So if you think about any event, and I had to break this down, and I do this in my book with kind of a football like chalkboard with like circles and X's, because that was the best way I could think to describe it.
For the audience to think about this, you've got charts laid out on how to break the room down. I mean, this isn't just like guessing. You literally are breaking this down into quadrants.
Yeah, it's literally a map. And what I realized was that every single event has the same basic layout, whether it's a party or a conference or a networking event or a work event. In the beginning, you have like a check-in table, coats, hats, the first little zone of the 5 or 10 feet around the door. The worst networkers stood right there. It was almost as if they were saying, I'm going to try to get people right as they enter. I'm going to try to get fresh meat. Or I'm too afraid to enter the room, so I'm just going to stand right here because I might be leaving at any moment, right? They wanted to make a quick exit if they had to. The problem with the start zone is that it was impossible for them to hold conversations. They could get a conversation, like they could get someone immediately, but oftentimes those conversations were extremely short. They didn't end up getting a card. The reason for this, I think, is because when people first arrive at an event, they're in survey mode, right? They're like, do I know anyone here? Where is the food? Where is the bathroom? Where can I get a drink? Who's the person that I should be talking to? So in those conversations, you had a lot of overhead gazing. You had people who excused themselves very quickly, and you had people who weren't fully committed to the conversation because they were kind of half wanting to go kind of move around the room. And so that was the worst place to stand for high quantity, low quality connections. The best place to stand was when the super connectors, and a lot of them did the exact same pattern. They would enter the room, they'd put down their coat, they'd check in at the check-in table, they would walk over to the bar, stand in line for the bar, wherever, if it was a kitchen, wherever the drinks were. And then after they had a drink, they would stand right in the spot where people exit the bar, specifically where someone has their drink in hand and then turns to face the room behind them. That was where they were waiting. Because, and psychologically this makes sense, after someone has checked in, put down their coat, said hi to the host or said hi to someone they know, the very next thing they do is get a drink. And when they turn to face, that is the moment of potential fear. Oh my gosh, I'm going to have no one to talk to. So if you have someone who steps in and says, hey, nice to meet you, I'm Greg, they become like a social savior. And that is exactly what happened for these people.
What a great tip, right? Everyone can remember this for the rest of their life. When you enter the cold room, even if you forget everything else, get people after they got their drink.
And be their savior, right? Like those are people who are desperately looking for something engaging, someone to talk to, a reason for being there. As you said earlier, why am I here? That was one of the first things you thought of. Most people are wondering that at an event. Why am I here? Was this worth it? In that moment, you can make it worth it for that person, right? You can say something, do something to be like, I'm going to make it worth it for this person to come tonight.
Okay, now, so we've now got the person, so we can actually leave this kind of example, because I've got a great line here from your work that I really love. We decide if we believe someone, if we like someone, and if we trust someone before we have even heard him or her speak. So now we've got this person that's kind of left the bar with their drink, and we look at them, and we've already decided.
Yes. Yes, that's true. And that was a huge problem for a lot of my introverts. My introverts listening, we like to think, and I even would try to convince myself of this, that our first impression happens the moment we start talking. So especially for my observers, my students who were really into kind of observe situation first, they would observe a situation or walk up to a group and kind of listen before they spoke. And they hoped their first impression happened with their opening line or the first thing they said. But actually, by the time we've said something, usually our first impression is far made and gone, and typically is quite permanent. In fact, research has found that once we make a first impression, it is incredibly hard to change it. Usually, subsequent interactions only become corollaries to the rule as opposed to changing the rule.
That's tough, right? I mean, because I've got my own internal biases these days at where I am in this stage of my life. And I know I can be blunt and abrasive sometimes. I could be nice sometimes. But I think, but I don't really, and I know this is not necessarily wise, but I know I sometimes really can't control those first impressions. So what I try to do is always just think, that those people that maybe we didn't have a good first impression, that we're going to, over time, if it's meant to be, it will come together. But I guess, sometimes with that kind of philosophy, and I'm not necessarily saying it's right, I'm sure there's some good connections that never get made that should have been made if I was using better technique.
Yeah, and although the science says that our first impressions are permanent, it doesn't mean that enough interactions can override it. So for example, let's say that you meet someone and you're having a really bad day. Really bad day, soaked through the rain, lots of traffic, had trouble getting to an event or a meeting. And so you walk in and you're just like a little bit curt, a little bit short, a little bit cold. And a person's like, wow, this person's a little bit uptight. Maybe they make that assumption of you. But you end up seeing them over the next few months at every single monthly meeting. And you're much warmer, you're yourself, you're asking about how they're doing. Enough of those interactions will override it, but you have to consciously know that you want to override it. For me, I have an idea. I try to think about, when I meet someone, how was my first impression? Like a little bit of self-diagnosis on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 was I like not my best self. 5 was I like, blowing it out of the water, like it was great. And I try to kind of keep track of those because I want to show my best self in further interactions.
Let me shift into a specific phrase that you use. I want you to define it for the audience. What is a conversational spark? It fits in well right now where we're talking about two strangers meeting, essentially.
Yes, it's the perfect segue. And so conversation was one of those things that eluded me for many years, and I could not figure out why until I realized that I was having the exact same conversation every single event, party, and meeting I was in. And the conversation went something like this. Maybe it sounds familiar to you. Hey, nice to meet you. I'm Vanessa. Yeah, so what do you do? Great. Where are you from? Wonderful. So, how did you get started in your career? Great.
No, I've already left the room before any of this has happened.
Yeah,
I've already gone home.
Right. Like that's how it went over and over again. Like I could have this conversation in my sleep and I could probably tell you their end of the conversation as well. And what I realized is I was interacting on default or on autopilot, where I was asking questions that were safe because they were socially acceptable. That made it so that my interactions had very little emotional or brain activity at all. And I read a study about dopamine, which dopamine is the pleasure chemical, or makes us feel that kind of really fun, excited feeling when someone says, "Oh, I have a gift for you." that spark of pleasure is dopamine. And so I was reading this study by Diana Tamir and found that we can actually spark dopamine beyond gifts and rewards. We can actually spark it in really good conversation. Amazing conversation starter is a gift. It literally creates pleasure in the brain. So I started to think to myself, how could you leave social scripts, leave the default questions, and try to trigger pleasure in conversations? And that's where I came up with the idea of having conversational sparks or conversational sparkers, where if you ask the right question or use the right words, you can literally create or spark pleasure in someone else's brain. So my challenge for everyone listening, and this was really hard for me, so I hope this won't be as hard for you as it was for me, to go on a conversation starter diet. No more what do you do, no more where are you from, no more how are you, and try to only ask conversational sparkers. Like, working on anything exciting recently? That's a really good one. When even saying the word excited gets people excited.
Well, how about this? What do you think about Trump?
We depends on what kind of conversation you want to have. I mean, that will spark something. That will spark something.
That's a dangerous spark. You could be 50% right or 50% wrong. So,
I mean, I'm of the opinion that any kind of spark is a good spark. Now, I don't want you to criticize someone, but I think that anytime you're engaging someone, it depends on what your answer is going to be if they ask you that question back. I would much prefer a intense conversation starter than a boring one. So I would choose, what do you think about Trump over how are you? Any day.
Yeah. I want to shift into something big picture that I know a lot of people, maybe they don't do it on a regular basis, but at some point in time in their life, they're faced with it. I want to talk about the stage. I want to talk about being alone on the stage with an audience. I've done this many times. I feel very comfortable with it. I know you've done it. I want you to kind of walk through your process. The only thing I would say from my experience, what I have learned over the years, is that in watching other people, so many other people on stage where they're just robots reading PowerPoint slides, they don't have any cognition of the audience is even there. But that'd be the biggest thing that I think I've learned over the years is that the moment you start making eye contact with the audience, like they're your friends, and you're just having a conversation with them, even if there's 1,000 people in the audience, that's it. You're already 100 times in a better place once you make that connection. But why don't you walk people through? You can go through some of your early experience or just map it out today, how you approach. You're being handed the microphone, Vanessa. You're being told, get on front of that stage and give these 500 people in that audience, give them something. What are you doing scientifically from the moment you grab the mic and you walk on stage and you start? Walk me through it.
Well, we did a study to look at this in a certain way. I love TED Talks. I wanted to know why certain TED Talks do better than others. Specifically, all TED Talkers are vetted. I mean, they're all amazing, intelligent experts in their field. They often go through many months of speaker training, but somehow there are the same 10 TED Talks that everyone has watched, and then there are thousands that just kind of fly under the radar. And I wanted to know why. Even the biggest celebrity TED Talkers don't have the most views. A lot of the most celebrity TED Talkers, like Ken Robinson and Amy Cuddy and Brene Brown or Simon Sinek, they were not famous before their TED Talk. Their TED Talks made them famous. So I wanted to know why. Analyzed thousands of hours of TED Talks in our lab looking for patterns. And we found that there are distinct patterns between the least popular TED Talkers and the most popular TED Talkers, so much so that you could probably watch the first few seconds of a TED Talk and guess if it had the likelihood to go viral. Or rather, there were certain deal breakers that made certain TED Talkers lose their chances to go viral. One of these was the fact that there was a big difference in vocal power between the most and least powerful TED Talkers. The least popular TED Talkers were all very well practiced. In fact, that actually hurt them. They were so practiced that they sounded memorized. So what happened was they would come on stage and see if this sounds familiar to you. They would say something like this. Today I want to talk to you about a big idea. And my big idea is the world needs to change. And the world
I'm turning that clip. I'm already done with you.
Yeah, exactly. You're done. You're going to log out. You're going to hit pause. You're going to hit skip. You're going to hit next, right? The TED Talkers, and this is exactly how Brene Brown and Ken Robinson and those talkers come out, is they come out like they're about to have coffee with you. They know their talk so well that it's no longer memorized, it's actually internalized, where it's literally just having a very powerful discussion from stage. So they come out and they say something like, today there's this really big idea, and it shocked me the first time I saw it, but I think that it's incredibly important. Tell me what you think. There's these 3 ideas, right? It's much more conversational. And that was one of the biggest differences. So when you're preparing for a talk, the worst thing you can do is prepare a script. In fact, please do not script out your interview questions, your talks. Never write it out. Your best thing to do is to bullet point ideas and stories. Those give you that kind of vocal power.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about Simon Sinek's, and he just comes off as like, who's this crazy, passionate guy? I've never heard of him before. He's really interesting, and he's so passionate about what he's talking about. Boom.
Yeah, and you can sense that he's speaking. I don't like to say speaking from the heart because I feel like that's too much of a cliche, but he's speaking from his gut in the sense that he doesn't have to remember a script. He's literally sharing something. Loves it.
He loves what he's figured out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Hey, I can't keep you. I know you've got to run. We need to get people to check you out. Where is the best website we can send people to, Vanessa? The book, Captivate, The Science of Succeeding with People. I could pick your mind all day long, and maybe we'll have to do a second one at some point in time. But these topics kind of all connect together, and you are taking people down the path in your newest work.
Yeah, thank you. Everything is at scienceofpeople.com. That's kind of our lab website. You can play in our lab, you can get the book, you can check out articles, and then Captivate is wherever books are sold, or so my publisher tells me.
Again, it's Captivate, The Science of Succeeding with People. Vanessa, thank you for coming on today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.